kind, lonely CEO offers shelter to a destitute girl on a rainy night, unaware she is the disguised daughter of the world's richest man on a secret quest for true kindness. Get out of my sight. Your presence is sullying the very air in this lobby. The rain hammered down on the polished marble plaza like 1,000 desperate fists, relentless and wild, each drop exploding in a spray of cold light under the harsh glare of the street lamps. Julian Vance stood just inside the cavernous, glass-walled lobby of his own building, the sound a dull roar that did little to drown out the sterile silence of his life. He watched the city blur into a watercolor of bleeding neon, his reflection in the pristine glass a pale, hollow ghost of a man who commanded an empire but owned nothing of value. The crisp, impeccable suit he wore felt like a cage, the polished gleam of his shoes a mockery of the worn, weary path his soul had been treading for 5 long years. He was frozen. The security guard's voice, sharp and cruel, had splintered the quiet hum of the building's after-hours atmosphere. Julian's gaze shifted from the storm outside to the source of the commotion. A young woman, no more than 20, was being shoved toward the revolving doors. Her clothes, a threadbare coat and jeans, were already soaked, clinging to a frame that looked far too fragile to withstand the biting cold of the October night. Her hair was plastered to her pale cheeks, and her eyes, wide and haunted, held a desperate, dignified plea that the guard met with a sneer of utter contempt. Her shoulders were slumped not in defeat, but in a profound weariness that seemed to radiate from her very bones, a state of being Julian understood with an intimacy that made his own chest tighten. He felt an old, forgotten mechanism in his heart begin to grind, a rusty gear turning for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. He should have just walked to his sleek, waiting car. He should have allowed the thick, soundproof glass to seal him away from the world's casual cruelty, just as he had every other night for the past 5 years. But her unflinching gaze, which held no anger, only a quiet, shattered sorrow, snagged on something deep inside him. It was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as the guard gave her a final, rough push, sending her stumbling out into the pounding rain. She faltered, her worn boots slipping on the slick pavement, and for a moment, it looked as if she might collapse right there. The heavy glass door hissed shut behind her, sealing her out. Total silence. The guard straightened his tie, his expression one of smug satisfaction, and turned, only to find his own reflection blocked by the commanding figure of Julian Vance. Julian's eyes were like chips of ice, holding an unspoken fury that made the guard's face drain of color. He didn't say a word. He simply walked toward the door, his movements fluid and deliberate, a predator in a world of clumsy men. The rain hit him with a physical shock, instantly plastering his dark hair to his scalp and soaking the shoulders of his $1,000 suit. He didn't even notice. His focus was entirely on the small, trembling figure huddled against the wall, trying to find some futile shelter from the deluge. He stopped before her, the torrent of water sluicing between them. She looked up, her eyes glistening with rain and something deeper, something raw and unbearable. He extended a hand, not to give her a coin, but to offer a simple human connection. His voice, when it came, was a low rumble against the symphony of the storm. "You can't stay out here," she simply stared, as if he were an apparition. He knew she was waiting for the catch, the transactional nature of a world that never gave without taking. But there was no catch. He was merely a hollow man who had seen another hollow soul and felt, for the first time in an eternity, a faint, undeniable echo. The young woman flinched at the sound of his voice, a brittle movement, as if she expected the words to be followed by a blow or another harsh dismissal. She watched him, her pale face a mask of disbelief, as the expensive fabric of his suit darkened with the relentless rain, the water running in rivulets down his gaunt cheeks. He was a man clearly from another world, a world of polished boardrooms and stately homes. Yet he stood before her in the downpour, making no move to shelter himself. He was getting soaked for her. The thought was so alien, so profoundly unexpected, that it short-circuited the defensive mechanisms she had so carefully constructed. Her own journey had begun as a test, a cynical experiment proposed by her father to prove that the world was governed by nothing more than greed and self-interest. For weeks, she had endured the scorn, the indifference, the casual cruelty of strangers, each encounter reinforcing her father's bleak worldview. But this man, with his haunted eyes and quiet, unwavering sincerity, was an anomaly. He was a variable she had not anticipated. Why? The word was barely a whisper, a puff of air stolen by the wind, but he heard it. It was a question that encompassed everything. Why are you talking to me? Why are you standing in the rain? Why do you care? Julian's expression didn't change, but something deep within his gaze softened. He didn't offer platitudes or easy answers, for he had none himself. Instead, he simply shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Because my mother taught me it's wrong to leave someone in the storm, the simplicity of the answer was more disarming than any grand gesture. It spoke of a forgotten time, of a moral compass that still pointed true despite the rust of grief that coated his life. He took another step closer, his presence creating a small shield against the wind. He was looking at her, but his gaze seemed to be focused on a point somewhere far beyond her, in a past that was clearly a source of profound pain. The narrator knew, even if Julian did not, that he wasn't just seeing a destitute girl. He was seeing every vulnerability, every sorrow, every person he had failed to protect from the storms of life. He was seeing his wife, Lily. He was seeing his daughter, Rose. He offered his hand again, his palm open and unthreatening. It was a gesture of pure, selfless aid. A sob caught in her throat. This single, quiet act of kindness was a more seismic event in her cloistered life than any multi-billion-dollar merger her father had ever orchestrated. It was real. It was untainted. It was everything she had secretly hoped to find and had begun to believe did not exist. With a trembling hand, she reached out and placed her small, cold fingers in his warm, steady grasp. His grip was gentle, a silent promise of safety. He led her away from the cold, unforgiving wall of the building and toward the gleaming, sleek black car that waited at the curb, its engine purring softly. The chauffeur, a man who had worked for Julian for a decade and had never seen him so much as offer a ride to a colleague, scrambled out with a large umbrella, his face a perfect picture of astonishment. Julian ignored him, opening the back door himself and gently guiding her inside. The warmth of the car enveloped her, a staggering contrast to the biting cold she had endured for hours. The scent of rich leather and something else, something clean and faintly of rain-soaked earth that was uniquely him, filled her senses. He slid in beside her, dripping water onto the immaculate floor mats. He was shivering. The drive was conducted in a heavy, unspoken silence, broken only by the soft click of the turn signal and the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers pushing away the torrent of rain. The girl, who had given her name as Lena, sat perfectly still on the plush leather seat, a warm, cashmere blanket Julian had retrieved from a compartment now wrapped around her fragile shoulders. She clutched a steaming cup of tea from a thermos the ever-prepared chauffeur had produced, the warmth seeping into her frozen fingers, a sensation so comforting it felt almost painful. She stole glances at the man beside her. Water dripped from the ends of his dark hair onto the collar of his ruined suit jacket, but he seemed utterly oblivious to his own discomfort. His profile was etched against the fleeting streetlights, a study in dignified sorrow. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes, fixed on the slick, dark road ahead, looked impossibly weary. She could see the deep lines of exhaustion around them, the hollowed-out look of a man who hadn't truly slept in years. It was a suffering far deeper than the physical hardship she was merely pretending to endure. Her own discomfort was a costume she could take off at any moment. His was etched into his very soul. She wondered what kind of tragedy could carve such profound grief into a man who seemingly had everything. The car eventually turned off the main road, gliding through a set of ornate iron gates and up a long, winding driveway flanked by ancient, weeping willows whose branches swayed like mourning figures in the wind. The house that emerged from the heavy fog was less a home and more a stately, cavernous mausoleum of modern architecture. It was all glass and dark stone, a magnificent structure that looked cold and unlived in, its few lit windows casting a flickering light that only emphasized the deep, swallowing shadows around them. He led her inside, the massive front door opening into a grand foyer with a polished marble floor and a ceiling so high their footsteps echoed in the vast, empty space. The air was still and chilled, holding the sterile silence of a place devoid of laughter or life. A sweeping staircase curved upwards into darkness. He didn't speak, but his actions were gentle and clear. He showed her to a guest suite on the ground floor, a room larger than the entire apartment she kept for her undercover excursions. It was decorated in impeccable but impersonal taste, with crisp white linens on the bed and minimalist art on the walls. It was a room for a visitor, not for family. He pointed to the ensuite bathroom. There are towels, and you'll find some things you can wear in the closet. My wife was about your size, the words cracked at the end, a barely perceptible splintering of his composed facade. It was the first clue, the first crack in the marble through which she could glimpse the shattered ruins of his heart. He backed out of the room, his hand still on the doorknob. Rest. You're safe here. The door clicked softly shut, leaving her alone in the opulent, silent room. She stood there for a long time, the blanket still clutched around her, listening to his retreating footsteps echo and then vanish into the oppressive quiet of the house. He had offered her shelter, warmth, and clothing, all without asking a single question, without a hint of suspicion or expectation. He had invoked the memory of his wife to offer her comfort, an act of such raw, tender vulnerability that it made her own deception feel like a physical weight in her chest. She had come out tonight to find the worst in humanity, and instead, she had stumbled upon its very best, hidden away in a heart that was clearly unbearably broken. She was Alara Sterling, daughter of the richest man in the world, and she had never felt poorer in her life. Julian retreated to his study, a room dominated by a single, massive mahogany desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with titles he hadn't touched in years. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid shimmering under the soft, flickering light of a single desk lamp. The neat spirit did nothing to warm the biting cold that had settled deep in his bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the rain-soaked suit he had finally discarded for a simple gray sweater. The house felt different tonight. For 5 years, its silence had been a familiar weight, a constant, heavy companion. But now, the presence of the quiet, fragile stranger in the guest room made the emptiness feel more acute, more profound. Her being there highlighted the absence of everyone else. He sank into his worn leather chair, the one Lily had always claimed was his true throne, and let his head fall back. Her ghost was everywhere in this house, a gentle, shimmering presence in every room. He could almost hear the echo of her quiet chuckle, see the way she used to curl up on the sofa with a book, her feet tucked underneath her, and Rose, his little girl, his innocent, bright spark. Her tiny, colorful drawings were still carefully preserved in a box in this very desk. The memory was a physical blow, a tightening in his chest that stole his breath. The car accident had not just taken their bodies. It had taken the very concept of home, leaving behind only a collection of rooms and a man haunted by the echoes of what used to be. Bringing the girl, Lena, home had been an impulse, an act driven by a flicker of the man he used to be, the man Lily had loved. A man who believed in simple decency. Seeing her, so desperate and alone, had resonated with the desperate, lonely core of his own being. He had saved her from the storm outside, but who would save him from the storm within? He hadn't known it then, but the simple act of opening his car door for this fragile stranger was the first step toward opening the locked doors of his own heart. He finished his whiskey in one long swallow, the burn a welcome distraction. He felt a strange sense of responsibility for her, a protective instinct he thought had died with his family. He found himself walking silently back down the hall, stopping just outside her door. He listened, hearing nothing but the soft hush of the house and the distant drumming of the rain, which was finally beginning to subside. He imagined her sleeping, safe and warm under his roof, and a feeling he couldn't quite name. Not happiness, not peace, but something adjacent to it, a quiet sense of rightness, settled over him. It was the first truly positive emotion he had allowed himself to feel in half a decade. He turned and walked away. He did not see the sliver of light under the door, nor did he know that on the other side, Alara Sterling was wide awake, her mind racing. She had changed into a soft, gray cashmere sweater and matching pants that had been left in the closet. They smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that felt sacred and intimate. She ran a hand over the soft fabric, her heart aching for the woman who had once worn it, and for the man who so clearly still loved her. This was no longer an experiment. This quiet, dignified, shattered man had unknowingly thrown down a gauntlet. Her father believed the world was transactional. Julian Vance was living proof that it was not. He had offered grace with no strings attached. She now felt an undeniable, profound duty to understand the source of his pain, and, if she could, to find a way to repay his selfless kindness. Her mission had changed. It was no longer about proving her father wrong. It was about proving Julian Vance right. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a soft, golden glow of sunlight. Julian awoke from a shallow, restless sleep on the couch in his study, the empty whiskey glass still on the table beside him. A heavy fog still clung to his mind, but for the first time in recent memory, it was pierced by a sliver of purpose that had nothing to do with stock prices or quarterly reports. He needed to check on Lena. He moved through the silent house, the morning light pouring through the massive windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, carefree spirits. He reached the guest room and hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He knocked softly. Silence. He knocked again, a little louder. Lena. When no answer came, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was perfectly made, the crisp white duvet smoothed without a single wrinkle. The cashmere clothes he had given her were neatly folded on a chair. On the polished surface of the nightstand, next to a glass of water she hadn't touched, was a small, folded piece of paper. A note. He walked over and picked it up, his heart pounding for a reason he couldn't articulate. The note was written on a simple piece of stationery from the desk in the room, the handwriting elegant and steady. It was short, but every word carried an immense weight. Thank you. You didn't just give me shelter from the storm. You reminded me that light exists in the dark. I will never forget that. It was unsigned. She was gone. The sense of loss that washed over him was absurdly, illogically immense. He had known her for less than 12 hours, a fleeting encounter with a nameless, desperate stranger. Yet her sudden absence made the house's cavernous emptiness feel more like a physical presence, a suffocating void that pressed in on him from all sides. He sank onto the edge of the perfectly made bed, the note clutched in his hand. He had expected her to be there. He realized with a jolt, been looking forward to seeing her in the light of day, to offering her breakfast, to perhaps learning a small piece of her story. He had wanted to help her. That desire, so long dormant, had been reawakened, only to be met with this quiet, final departure. It felt like another loss, a small but sharp echo of the great, shattering loss that had defined his existence. He had let another person in, however briefly, and now she too had vanished. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, the simple thank you note feeling as significant as any multi-million-dollar contract on his desk. He had the chauffeur discreetly check the local shelters, the police precincts, anywhere a person with no resources might end up. There was no sign of her. It was as if she had been a phantom, a spirit conjured by the storm to test him, only to dissipate with the morning sun. Weeks turned into a month. The memory of the girl with the haunted eyes and the quiet dignity began to feel like a dream, but the effect she'd had on him lingered. The profound silence of his home was no longer a state of passive grief. It was an active problem to be solved. He started leaving a light on in the foyer at night. He bought flowers, vibrant, colorful bouquets of lilies and roses, and placed them in a vase on the grand entryway table, their fragrance a small rebellion against the sterile air. He didn't know why he was doing it, only that the brief, selfless act of helping her had reminded him that he was still capable of feeling something other than pain. He was a man slowly, tentatively, searching for a reason to live again, completely unaware that the reason was already searching for him. Alara Sterling, now back in her world of crisp suits and sterile boardrooms, found that the gilded cage felt more restrictive than ever. The memory of Julian Vance's quiet kindness and the palpable grief that clung to him like a shroud had taken root in her mind. Her father, Marcus Sterling, a man whose emotional range was limited to disappointment and impatience, had listened to her account of the evening with a dismissive grunt. "An anomaly," he had declared, waving a hand as if to brush away the entire experience. "One bleeding heart doesn't disprove the rule, Alara. The world runs on currency, not kindness. You were lucky you ran into a fool," his words, meant to be a lesson in worldly wisdom, struck her as the ramblings of a man who was emotionally bankrupt. She saw with undeniable clarity that her father's immense wealth was a fortress he had built to protect himself from a world he didn't trust, a fortress that had become his prison. She was determined not to let it become hers as well. Using the vast resources at her disposal, she began a discreet investigation into Julian Vance. It didn't take long to uncover the tragedy that defined him. The news articles were clinical and brief, detailing the horrific car accident on a rain-slicked road 5 years prior that had claimed the lives of his wife, Lily, a celebrated violinist, and their 6-year-old daughter, Rose. The story shattered her. She now understood the source of the unbearable sadness in his eyes, the hollow echo in his magnificent home. He wasn't just a kind man. He was a man who had lost everything that mattered and still found it within himself to be kind. The knowledge galvanized her. Her quiet observation turned into a renewed, focused purpose. She couldn't simply walk back into his life as Alara Sterling, the billionaire's heiress. The power imbalance would ruin the purity of what had passed between them. The connection they had shared was between a grieving man and a girl with nothing, and she needed to understand that connection further. She had to see him again as Lena. She devised a plan, one that felt both insane and absolutely necessary. She created a new identity for Lena, complete with a plausible backstory and forged, but impeccable, references. She applied for an entry-level position in the mailroom at Vance Innovations. It was a ludicrous step down from her life, but it was the only way she could get close to him without raising suspicion, to observe the man in his natural habitat, to see if the kindness he had shown her was an aberration or his true nature. The interview was a blur. She was hired on the spot by a harried HR manager who barely glanced at her resume. Her first day was a lesson in anonymity. She was just another face in a sea of thousands of employees, a ghost in the machine of his empire. For weeks, she sorted mail, delivered packages, and kept her head down, all the while watching. She saw him in the elevators, a remote, commanding figure surrounded by a coterie of nervous executives. She saw the respect he commanded, but also the distance he kept. He was admired, but not known. Then, one evening, fate, or perhaps her own subconscious maneuvering, intervened. She was working late, catching up on a backlog of inter-office deliveries, when she saw him walking the deserted hallways of the executive floor. His shoulders slumped with a familiar weariness. He was heading back to his office, clearly intending to work deep into the night. On impulse, she followed him at a distance. She watched as he stood before his office door, his hand on the handle, hesitating. He looked so utterly alone that her heart ached. She remembered the warmth of the tea he had given her, a simple gesture of comfort. She went to the executive lounge, a place she was not supposed to be, and prepared a pot of chamomile tea, just the way she imagined he might like it. Her heart thudded wildly. This was a risk. This could expose her. But she had to. With the tray trembling in her hands, she walked to his office, the door of which was slightly ajar. She knocked softly. He looked up from a stack of papers, his expression confused. And then his eyes focused on her face. Recognition dawned, slow and then sudden, like the sun breaking through heavy fog. He froze. Julian stared at the young woman standing in his doorway, a delicate porcelain teacup and saucer trembling slightly on the tray she held. It was her. It was Lena, the girl from the storm, He felt a seismic jolt, a disorienting sense of temporal displacement, as if the past month had been a dream and he was waking up back on that rainy night. Her hair was clean and tied back neatly, and she was wearing the simple, nondescript uniform of a mailroom clerk, but the eyes were the same, those steady, quiet, haunted eyes that seemed to see right through the facade of the powerful CEO to the shattered man within. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind, but the only word that came out was a soft, incredulous whisper. "You," she gave a small, nervous smile, her own carefully constructed composure threatening to splinter under the intensity of his gaze. "I work here now. I saw your light was on, and I remembered you liked tea." She said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if destitute girls he rescued from storms often ended up sorting his mail. The sheer improbability of it was staggering, yet her presence felt undeniably, profoundly real. A slow warmth spread through his chest, chasing away some of the persistent chill that lived there. She hadn't been a phantom. She was real, and she was here. He gestured toward the small seating area in the corner of his office. "Please, come in," she entered hesitantly, placing the tray on the low coffee table between two plush armchairs. The silence that settled between them was not awkward, but filled with 1,000 unspoken things. It was the same comfortable, heavy silence from the car ride, a silence that seemed to acknowledge their shared understanding of sorrow. He sat opposite her, forgoing the tea for now, his attention focused entirely on her. "I looked for you," he confessed, his voice raw. "After that night, I was worried." Her eyes glistened, and she looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "You didn't need to be. You had already done more than enough. Why didn't you stay?" he asked, the question that had echoed in his empty house for weeks. She finally looked up, her gaze unflinching. "Because I didn't want to be a burden. You had your own ghosts. I didn't want to add to them." The word ghosts hung in the air between them, a stark and courageous acknowledgement of the grief that was his constant companion. No one ever spoke of it so directly. His colleagues, his board members, even his few remaining friends, they all skirted around the issue of Lily and Rose, treating his grief like a disease they were afraid to catch. But this young woman, this practical stranger, had named it, had looked it right in the eye without flinching. It was cathartic. For the first time, he felt seen. He found himself telling her. The words poured out of him, not in a torrent, but in a slow, steady stream of pain he had held back for 5 years. He spoke of Lily's laugh, of the way she would play her violin late at night, filling the house with a sound so beautiful it felt sacred. He spoke of Rose's love for painting, her small hands always smudged with color, of a little locket he had given her with their picture inside, a locket that was now just a painful, cherished memory. He didn't cry. He was long past tears, but his voice cracked, and his hands clenched and unclenched on his knees. Throughout his confession, Lena just listened. She didn't offer empty platitudes or tell him it would be all right. She simply bore witness to his pain, her steady, empathetic gaze a safe harbor in his turbulent sea of memory. When he finally fell silent, the raw, unspoken grief having been given voice at last, she reached across the table and placed her hand gently on his. Her touch was warm, a simple, anchoring point of human connection. "It's hard," she said softly, "to live in a big, empty house." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw that the sadness in her eyes was not just for him. It was her own. "You too?" he asked. She nodded, withdrawing her hand. "In a way. My father, he's a very successful man. We live in a place much bigger than this, but he fills it with things, not with warmth. I've been lonely my whole life." They sat there for a long time, two people from opposite ends of the universe, forging a bond in the quiet, sterile office high above the sleeping city. It was a connection born not of romance or attraction, but of a shared, profound understanding of loneliness. He had saved her from a storm, and now she was saving him from the silence. Their late-night conversations became a quiet ritual, a sacred, unspoken appointment at the end of wearying days. Lena, as he knew her, would appear at his office door with a tray, sometimes with tea, sometimes with leftovers from the corporate cafeteria she had saved. They would talk for hours, sharing stories that were carefully curated mosaics of their lives. He spoke more of Lily and Rose, finding that saying their names aloud to her didn't feel like tearing open a wound, but rather like tending to a cherished memory. She, in turn, spoke of her fictional past, weaving a narrative of a struggling but dignified life, all the while embedding truths about her real feelings of isolation and disillusionment. She was a master storyteller, painting a picture of a life of hardship that made his heart ache with a protective tenderness, never realizing the true hardship she described was an emotional one, not a financial one. Julian found himself changing. He started leaving the office earlier, a small, hopeful anticipation bubbling in his chest at the thought of their quiet time together. His employees noticed the shift. The hollow, haunted look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a soft, gentle light. The grim set of his jaw would occasionally relax into a semblance of a smile when Lena delivered a package to his floor. He was coming back to life, breath by painful breath, and she was the oxygen he didn't know he was starving for. He promoted her from the mailroom to a position as his personal administrative assistant, a move that raised eyebrows among the executive staff but one Julian justified with a curt, unassailable logic. She was efficient, organized, and, most importantly, he trusted her. The lie was easy to believe because the underlying truth was so potent. He did trust her implicitly. He trusted her with his grief, with the fragile, flickering flame of his own rebirth. What he didn't know was that Alara was using her newfound proximity to him for her own secret mission. She saw the vultures circling. Specifically, a board member named Victoria Croft, a woman with ambition as sharp and cold as polished steel. Alara watched as Victoria subtly undermined Julian in meetings, questioning his decisions with a veneer of professional concern that barely masked her contempt. Victoria saw Julian's growing reliance on a nobody from the mailroom as a sign of weakness, of emotional instability, and she was methodically building a case to have him removed as CEO. Alara began quietly compiling her own dossier, using her access to company communications and her own formidable intellect to document Victoria's every treacherous move. She was no longer just a passive observer. She was his hidden savior, his unwavering guardian angel, preparing for a war he didn't even know was coming. The company's annual charity gala was the event of the season, a glittering affair held in the city's most ornate ballroom. Julian had dreaded it, as he did all public events, but he asked Lena to attend with him, not as a date, but as his assistant, his anchor in a sea of prying eyes and empty smiles. She agreed, her heart a frantic mix of excitement and trepidation. She chose a simple, elegant but unassuming navy blue dress, careful to maintain her persona. The evening started smoothly. Julian, with Lena by his side, navigated the room with a newfound, quiet confidence. But as the night wore on, Alara could feel the tension mounting. She saw Victoria Croft moving through the crowd, whispering in the ears of other powerful board members. Her lips curved in a predatory smile. She was laying the groundwork for her attack. The moment came during the keynote address. The chairman of the board had just finished a glowing speech about the company's fiscal success, and he invited Julian to the stage to say a few words. As Julian approached the podium, Victoria Croft stepped forward, holding a microphone. "Before Mr. Vance speaks," she said, her voice ringing with false deference, "I believe there are some concerns we, as a board, need to address publicly." A heavy hush fell over the cavernous ballroom. Julian froze, his face paling under the bright stage lights. Victoria's eyes, cold and merciless, found his. Concerns about leadership, about a CEO who has, for 5 years, been operating under the shadow of profound personal tragedy. A CEO whose judgment has become sentimental, who elevates a mailroom clerk with no qualifications to a position of immense trust. She gestured dismissively toward Lena, who stood mortified by the side of the stage. The humiliation was a physical blow. The crowd murmured, their faces a mixture of pity and cruel curiosity. Victoria moved in for the kill. "We need a leader who is strong, decisive, and uncompromised. Not a man who is clearly still so shattered by grief that he makes decisions with his broken heart instead of his head." She had weaponized his pain, turning his most sacred sorrow into a corporate liability. Julian stood there, speechless and trembling, the world splintering around him. He was exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket of public humiliation. Julian stood on the stage, exposed under the glare of the spotlights, feeling as though every whispering guest was dissecting the raw, open wound of his grief. Victoria Croft's words were shards of ice embedded in his heart, each one a testament to the world's cold, transactional cruelty. He looked over at Lena, who stood pale and trembling, her eyes wide with shock and horror for him. He felt a surge of protective anger, not for himself, but for her, for the way she had been so callously used as a weapon against him. But he was powerless, his voice stolen by the sheer brutality of the attack. He was drowning. Just as he felt the last of his strength give way, the ornate double doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a soft, authoritative click. Two figures entered, their entrance so commanding that every head in the room turned. The first was a man whose face was known the world over, though he was rarely seen in public, Marcus Sterling, the reclusive multibillionaire, a titan of industry whose quietest whisper could cause seismic shifts in the global market. He was flanked by a security detail, but his presence alone was an impenetrable force. But it was the woman beside him who made the entire room gasp. She was no longer Lena, the quiet, unassuming mailroom clerk. The simple navy dress was gone, replaced by an impeccable, custom-made gown of deep emerald silk that shimmered under the chandeliers. Her hair was styled in an elegant chignon, and a necklace of staggering, brilliant diamonds graced her throat. She moved with an innate grace and power that was nothing short of regal. It was Alara Sterling, the heiress to an unimaginable fortune, looking every bit the queen she was born to be. She walked through the parted crowd, her gaze locked on the stage, her expression one of calm, controlled fury. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't have to. Her focus was entirely on the stunned, speechless Victoria Croft. Alara ascended the small steps to the stage, taking the microphone from a dumbfounded stagehand. She stood beside Julian, a silent, unwavering pillar of support, and faced the stunned audience. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent room, crisp and commanding. "My name is Alara Sterling." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. "For the past several months, I have been working undercover at Vance Innovations. Ms. Croft is correct about one thing. I started in the mailroom. She calls this sentimental judgment on Mr. Vance's part. I call it the single greatest testament to his character." Her eyes found Victoria's, and they were filled with a cold, righteous fire. Victoria Croft speaks of strength, but she confuses cruelty with power. She speaks of a leader being uncompromised, but she mistakes a lack of empathy for focus. The world is full of men and women like her. People who believe that a heart is a liability in business. She then turned her gaze to Julian, and her expression softened, filled with a profound, undeniable tenderness that hushed the room once more. This man, Julian Vance, lost everything, and in his darkest hour, on a night when he had every reason to shut the world out, he saw a stranger in need and offered her shelter, not because he wanted something in return, but simply because it was the right thing to do. That stranger was me. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. "His sentimental judgment," she continued, her voice ringing with passion, "is the rarest and most valuable commodity in this world. It is called integrity. It is called compassion. It is called humanity. It is the very foundation upon which any lasting enterprise should be built." She paused, letting the words sink in. Then, she delivered the final, devastating blow. She looked out at the sea of faces, her voice clear and unwavering. "My father, Marcus Sterling, and I are so confident in this man's leadership, a leadership based on character and not just on profit margins, that as of this morning, Sterling Industries has acquired a 51% controlling stake in Vance Innovations." The shock was palpable. Victoria Croft's face was a mask of shattered disbelief. Her career, her ambition, her entire world had just vanished. "Our first act," Alara declared, her eyes once again on Victoria, will be to call an immediate vote on the board's composition. I think we all know how that will turn out. She placed the microphone back on the podium. The power dynamic had not just been reversed. It had been utterly and seismically annihilated. Total silence. Then, from the back of the room, someone began to applaud. It was followed by another and another, until the entire ballroom erupted in a thunderous ovation. Not for the corporate takeover, but for the profound act of loyalty and poetic justice they had just witnessed. Julian stared at Alara, at this powerful, magnificent woman who had been his quiet confidant, his gentle healer. He was in a state of utter, overwhelming disbelief. She had not only saved him, she had championed his broken heart as his greatest strength. Hope, real and dazzling, flooded his soul. He was not alone anymore. The aftermath of the gala was a blur of frantic energy, hushed congratulations, and the swift, ignominious exit of Victoria Croft. Julian moved through it all as if in a dream, his mind struggling to reconcile the two realities of the woman standing beside him. Lena, the gentle, fragile girl who shared tea with him in the quiet of his office, and Alara Sterling, the formidable heiress who had just dismantled his enemies with a few calm, devastating sentences. Once they were finally free of the crowds, back in the sleek, silent limousine that belonged to her father, the silence between them was thick with everything that had happened. Julian finally turned to her, his expression a mixture of awe, confusion, and a dawning, profound gratitude. Why? It was the same question she had asked him all those months ago in the pounding rain, and it carried the same weight of a world turned upside down. Alara's regal composure melted away, and she was just Lena again, her eyes soft and filled with a raw sincerity. Because you were the first person in my entire life who saw me, not what I represented, she said, her voice barely a whisper. That night, you didn't see a beggar girl, to be pitied or a problem to be ignored. You just saw a person who was cold and alone. You offered me kindness when you had every reason to have none left to give. I started this whole thing as a test, to see if my father was right about the world. You were the answer I was looking for, Julian. His name on her lips sounded different now, intimate and real. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. The diamonds of her rings felt cold against his skin, a reminder of the vast chasm between their worlds. But the warmth of her hand was the same. It was the same gentle, anchoring touch that had brought him so much comfort. My entire life has been a transaction, she continued, her gaze unwavering. Every relationship, every friendship, was predicated on what people could get from me, from my family. You wanted nothing. You gave everything. You showed me what it was to be truly wealthy. A single perfect tear traced a path down her cheek. I think I started falling in love with you that first night, when you stood in the rain for me. But I fell completely in love with the man who told me stories about his wife and daughter, the man who still loved them so much that his heart had no room for bitterness. I didn't want to save your company, Julian. I wanted to save you from the loneliness that was killing you, just as you saved me from mine, his heart. The broken, battered thing he thought was beyond repair began to beat with a fierce, wild rhythm. The fog of grief that had shrouded his world for 5 long years finally began to recede, burned away by the brilliant, dazzling light of her confession. He saw her, truly saw her, not as Lena the assistant or Alara the heiress, but as the magnificent, brave, and impossibly kind soul who had walked into his life and patiently, gently, pieced him back together. He started, his voice thick with emotion. I thought I could never feel this again. I thought that part of me died with them. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a tender, reverent kiss to her knuckles. You didn't just bring my company back to life, Alara. You brought me back in the soft, amber hue of the car's interior lights, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city at night. He leaned in. The kiss was not one of desperate passion, but of profound, cathartic release. It was a kiss of gratitude, of recognition, of 2 lonely souls finally, miraculously, finding their way home. It was a promise of a new beginning, built on the foundation of the purest kindness. 1 year later, The stately, cavernous mansion was no longer silent. The deep shadows that once clung to the corners of every room had been chased away by a warm, golden glow that seemed to emanate not just from the lamps, but from the very walls themselves. The air, once sterile and still, was now filled with the soft strains of a violin. Not a recording, but a lyra, playing one of Lily's favorite concertos on the very instrument Julian had kept so carefully preserved in its case. She wasn't a master like Lily had been, but she played with a sincere, heartfelt passion that filled the house with love. Laughter, real and frequent, now echoed in the grand foyer where his footsteps had once sounded so lonely. Julian sat in his old leather armchair in the study, but he wasn't looking at spreadsheets or market reports. He was watching Alara through the open doorway, a gentle, unwavering smile on his face. The haunted, hollow look in his eyes was gone completely, replaced by a deep, abiding peace. He was no longer a ghost in his own home. He was its heart. Together, they had transformed the house from a mausoleum of memory into a sanctuary of new life. The guest room where she had once stayed was now her painting studio, its walls covered in vibrant canvases, her own artistic rebellion against a life that had once been so colorless. They had established the Lily and Rose Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to providing arts education and safe shelter for underprivileged children, pouring their resources and their hearts into creating a legacy of kindness in the names of the two people he had lost. His work had changed, too. With the full backing of Sterling Industries and Alara's keen insights by his side, Vance Innovations had shifted its focus, pioneering new technologies that prioritized human connection and social good over simple profit. He was no longer just a CEO. He was a leader with a profound, renewed purpose, proving every day that compassion was not a weakness, but the ultimate strength. Later that evening, they stood on the terrace, a soft breeze rustling the leaves of the weeping willows. The city lights glittered below them, no longer a cold, distant galaxy, but a beautiful, sprawling tapestry of which they were a vital part. Alara leaned her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked softly. "The storm." He smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Every single day. It was the luckiest day of my life." "Mine too," she whispered, her fingers tracing the lapel of his jacket. She paused, then looked up at him, her eyes shimmering in the moonlight. "Thank you, Julian, for seeing me." He turned to face her, cupping her cheek in his hand. His touch was warm and steady. "Thank you, Alara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that would never fade, "for showing me how to live again." Their life together was a quiet, beautiful testament to the enduring power of a single, selfless act. It was proof that the deepest wounds could be healed, that the most profound loneliness could be conquered, and that true love was not about grand gestures, but about finding the one person who would stand with you in the rain, offering you shelter from the storm, both outside and within. They had found their happily ever after, not in a fairy tale castle, but in the quiet, sacred space of a healed and shared heart. This story, at its core, is a timeless fable. It serves as a profound reminder that the greatest acts of heroism are often the quietest, and the truest measure of wealth is not found in a bank account, but in the capacity of one's heart. It illustrates how a single, selfless act of kindness, offered without expectation of reward, can set in motion a chain of events so powerful it can heal shattered souls, mend broken worlds, and rewrite destinies. Julian's simple offer of shelter was a lighthouse beam in the fog of Alara's cynicism, while her unwavering belief in his goodness became the anchor that pulled him back from the depths of his grief. Their journey teaches us that vulnerability is not a weakness, but a bridge to connection, and that the deepest bonds are forged not in shared joy, but in the sacred, shared space of acknowledged pain. If this story touched your heart and reaffirmed your faith in the quiet power of human decency, we hope you'll carry its message with you. In a world that so often feels transactional and cold, remember the story of Julian and Alara. Remember that you never truly know the storms another person is facing, and a simple gesture of compassion, a warm cup of tea, a shared umbrella, an empathetic ear, can be the act of salvation that changes everything. The love they found was a direct result of choosing kindness when it would have been easier to choose indifference, a choice that is available to every single one of us, every single day. For more inspiring and soul-stirring narratives that celebrate the enduring power of love and compassion, please like, share, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales. Your support helps us continue to create and share these heartwarming stories that remind us of the beauty and goodness that exists in the world. Join our community and let us continue to explore the profound, life-changing journey of the human heart together. We'll see you in the next one.